Evening light leaked across the Bavarian hills like the last breath of a dying fire, turning the muddy road into a ribbon of copper and ash. Along it moved a column of exhausted Polish and Ukrainian laborers. Thin figures bowed beneath burlap sacks, stumbling in clumps as if each step were an accusation. Their shoes were falling apart. Their breath came out in small, ragged clouds. An SS officer barked at them to keep pace, though he himself looked half-starved, his voice thin with desperation rather than authority. The road smelled of damp soil, manure, and the sour fear of people who had learned that the world behind them was already gone and the world ahead might be worse. Watching them from the roadside fence stood a 19-year-old German labor girl, her work apron still dusted with grain husks. Her hands clutched the wooden rails as if the earth itself needed holding still. She had grown up on speeches proclaiming that Germany was invincible, that foreign workers were barely human, and that Americans would show no mercy. Yet none of those lessons prepared her for the sight of the Ukrainian girl nearly collapsing into the mud, or the Polish man trying to lift her despite barely being able to stand himself. Something inside her, brittle for months, finally cracked. She had spent the morning pretending the world was continuing normally, feeding the cows, sweeping the stable, avoiding the farmer's wife who muttered that the Americans were close, too close. At noon, she heard the rumble of distant engines rolling over the hills. By late afternoon, the SS officer had arrived at the farm with curt orders. All foreign laborers were to be marched away immediately. No explanation, no destination, simply away. That single word carried every rumor she had heard whispered after dark. Columns of prisoners marched until they dropped, shots fired whenever someone fell behind, bodies left beside ditches like forgotten sacks of grain. Fear pulsed in her throat as she watched the group assemble, their eyes hollow with the understanding that no help would come from the people who had controlled their lives for years. She felt the weight of her own uniform. Simple work clothes, nothing like the black sheen of the SS. But suddenly it felt as condemnatory as any armband. When the column started moving, she followed instinctively, drawn by something more urgent than loyalty or obedience. Her boots sank into the soft mud as she hurried toward the road. The SS officer noticed her, but dismissed her as one more frightened girl who didn't understand orders. Only when she stepped directly in front of the stumbling workers did he shout for her to move aside, brandishing his pistol like a threat he no longer had the strength to back with conviction. Yet she did not move. Her breath shook. Behind her, the foreign laborers halted in a wavering line, looking at her with disbelief. In that moment, she understood how small she was. One girl, one heartbeat, one fear, but also how enormous the choice was that stood before her. The distant engines grew louder, no longer faint, but rolling steadily like thunder dragged across steel. She saw a glimmer of sunlight bounce off metal, a tank turret cresting the hill, then another beside it. American soldiers, men she had been raised to fear, to hate, to believe would burn farms and execute anyone in German clothing. She imagined them looking at her, and seeing only the uniform, only the enemy. But she also saw the SS officer's hand closing around his pistol, preparing to force the column forward, perhaps preparing to shoot if necessary. The foreign workers seemed suspended between forces that neither cared for their names nor their futures. A cold wind swept across the fields and flattened the wheat in one long shiver. Something inside her snapped its final tether. She ran. Mud splashed up her legs as she sprinted down the road, heart pounding so violently she feared it would burst. She threw herself into the open space between the SS officer and the approaching tanks, raising both hands so high her shoulders burned. Her voice cracked across the road like a breaking branch. "I am begging you," she shouted, the English words trembling out of her. "Please, not them." Her cry hung in the air, carried by wind and disbelief. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The SS officer stared at her as if stunned that a German girl would dare stand against him. The prisoners watched her as though she were performing sorcery. And the Americans, still distant but now clearly visible, shifted formation, their turrets angling toward the confrontation with slow, deliberate intelligence. The road vibrated beneath her boots as the American vehicles advanced. One tank braked sharply, its shreds grinding into the gravel. A jeep rolled up beside it, soldiers raising rifles. She felt every muscle in her body coil with fear. She had disrupted a Nazi operation. She had thrown herself in front of armed Americans. She had broken rules that had governed her world since childhood. For a fleeting instant, she wondered whether this was how foolish people died, standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment, driven by impulses they could no longer explain. But as the soldiers approached, she saw no hatred in their eyes, only confusion, tension, and a quick, sweeping assessment of danger. The SS officer tried to shout something, but the Americans raised their weapons in an unmistakable order to drop the gun. A warning shot cracked through the air, punching dirt near his boots. The foreign laborers gasped. The officer hesitated, his bravado collapsing as he recognized exactly who held the stronger position. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his pistol. The girl exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The wind carried a faint smell of gasoline and unfamiliar coffee from the American convoy. One soldier stepped toward her, cautiously, as if unsure whether she were victim, collaborator, or something in between. Behind him, another GI tossed a chocolate bar toward a trembling Polish man, who caught it as though it were a fragile sacred object. The sight struck her with a force she could not describe. All her life, she had been told Americans would destroy everything German. Yet here they were, armed, exhausted, wary, but offering food instead of fear. She felt her knees weaken. The world she knew, built on slogans and certainty, tilted beneath her. And as the laborers clustered together, whispering in gratitude and shock, the girl realized that whatever happened next, whatever judgment awaited her, one truth had already rewritten her life. The enemy she had been taught to fear had not come to kill her. They had come to save the people her own government intended to destroy. And now, with dusk deepening and the SS disarmed, she sensed that the real reckoning, hers and Germany's, was only beginning. The moment the American rifles forced the SS officer to lower his weapon did not end the danger. It merely froze it, like a photograph whose shadows hinted at a much larger story. To understand why a Bavarian farm road had become a battleground for fear, mercy, and survival, one must step backward in time to the months when the war's collapse seeped quietly into everyday routines. Long before American tanks appeared on the horizon, the girl had lived between two worlds, the one in speeches and the one in the barnyard. The first promised order. The second revealed the cost of enforcing it. Her life on the farm had begun with the brisk certainty of government summonses. She had been 19, a member of the labor service mandated for young women, told she would help feed the nation. The training halls taught her that service was honor, that foreigners worked because they had threatened Germany, and that loyalty meant obedience. But the farm to which she was assigned smelled less like patriotic duty and more like manure, sweat, and the quiet resignation of people who labored because they had no choice. The first mornings were the hardest. She would push open the barn door and see the foreign workers already at their tasks. Polish and Ukrainian men and women who moved with an exhausted efficiency, always watched by the farmer or his son. They rarely looked up. She noticed their hands first, cracked, blistered, and swollen from lifting tools she struggled to lift herself. Everything about the system insisted she keep her distance. Germans ate in the kitchen. Foreign laborers ate beside the barn. Germans slept in heated rooms. The others slept in drafty lofts or sheds lined with straw. Even their laughter, when it came, sounded cautious, as though joy itself were rationed. Yet proximity is a dangerous seed. She began to see details that propaganda had never mentioned. The way the Ukrainian girl tied her hair with a bit of blue string, the way a Polish man hummed a lullaby that sounded like something her mother once sang, the way they flinched whenever the farmer's son raised his voice, no matter the reason. She caught herself wanting to speak to them, but the rules curved around her like iron bars. Still, small gestures leaked through the cracks. A shared crust of bread, a warning when a horse seemed restless, a silent nod exchanged over a bucket of feed. These moments were tiny, but they accumulated like snowdrifts, quiet, soft, and unstoppable. As winter dragged toward spring, the world beyond the farm grew louder. Refugees from the east passed through the village with carts full of children and bundles. They brought stories that settled like ash. Soviet armies advancing, cities burned, columns of prisoners marched from camps because guards refused to let the Allies see them alive. At night, she lay awake listening to rumors scrape the walls. People whispered that the Americans had crossed the Rhine, that they were pushing toward Munich, that their tanks were faster than anyone had expected. Some villagers prayed for a miracle. Others hid valuables or fled. The farmer tried to keep the routine steady, but even he could not pretend when rations shrank and the radio crackled with panic speeches. Then the first signs appeared. A distant column of prisoners shuffled through a neighboring village. Thin men escorted by SS guards, walking as if gravity had doubled. No one asked where they were going. No one needed to. Soon after came the order that changed everything. An SS officer rode up to the farm one afternoon, his motorcycle streaked with mud, his face hollow. He handed the farmer a paper stamped with an eagle and told him the foreign laborers must be assembled immediately. They would be taken east or south, away from the approaching Americans. No exceptions. No delays. The girl felt her stomach twist when she heard the destination was not even specified. The foreign workers understood instantly. She saw it in their eyes. The mixture of dread and resignation. The quiet calculation that the march might be their last. The Ukrainian girl tied her blue-string hair with trembling hands. The Polish man hummed nothing now. They lined up with the stillness of people who had run out of choices. The girl tried to ask the officer where he was taking them, but he ignored her. She tried to tell the farmer's wife that this seemed wrong, but the woman hissed at her to stay silent. Questions, she said, can get you killed this late in the war. The march began. The SS officer walked alongside the column with a revolver at his hip and a tightening impatience in his stride. The girl followed them to the road, unable to look away. She watched one man stumble. She watched another try to lift him, even though both could barely walk. And then she saw the officer reach for his pistol, perhaps to threaten, perhaps to assert control, perhaps simply because fear had stripped him of judgment. Her breath caught. She felt the moment tilting towards something irreversible. When she stepped into the road, she did not think of consequences. She thought only of how wrong it felt to let these people be swallowed by the dark. She planted herself between the officer and the column, her boots sinking in the mud. The officer shouted for her to move. She didn't. She felt the foreign workers pausing behind her, their confusion almost palpable. And then, rising over the hills, came the sound that had haunted the village for days. Engines. Heavy, mechanical, relentless. American engines. She turned and saw glints of sunlight on metal. Tanks. Trucks. A convoy rolling fast. The officer reached for his pistol again, and she realized she was now caught between two forces neither of which she controlled. In that instant, she felt the full weight of everything she had ignored. The lies she believed, the truths she glimpsed, and the people she had quietly begun to see as human. She ran toward the oncoming vehicles, adrenaline surging like fire through her limbs. Raising her hands, she shouted in the only English she knew, "I am begging you, please." Her voice cracked, but the tanks slowed. Soldiers scanned the scene, rifles lifting. Now, standing in the middle of the road with mud on her boots and fear in her chest, she felt the consequence of her choice arriving on steel treads. The Americans were nearly upon them. The SS officer was still armed. The foreign workers huddled behind her, as if hope and danger had collided in a single point. And as the lead tank ground to a halt, she realized there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would reshape her life, and perhaps determine whether those behind her lived long enough to see another sunrise. The first American tank screeched to a halt with a metallic groan that vibrated through the road and straight into her bones. Dust rippled outward, cloaking the moment in a pale haze like a battlefield caught between breaths. The barrel of the turret swung toward the SS officer with slow, threatening elegance, while the soldiers perched on the tank, lean, mud-splattered, squinting beneath their helmets, looked down at the scene as if unsure whether they had stumbled upon a firefight, a surrender, or a tragedy already in motion. The girl stood in the center of the road with her hands still raised, breath hitching in her throat, realizing only now how easily she could be mistaken for a collaborator or a lure. Her fear tasted metallic, sharp enough to cut. The SS officer barked something in German, a harsh command swallowed by engine noise. His hand jerked toward his pistol again, but this time the response was immediate. A crack from an American rifle split the air, kicking up dust at his feet. The officer froze, suddenly very small against the deep green bulk of the Sherman tank. A second GI shouted in English, firm, clipped, unmistakably in control. Though she didn't understand every word, she grasped the tone instantly. Drop the weapon or die. The foreign laborers behind her huddled together, unsure whether to flee or obey. Their eyes darted from the SS officer to the Americans to the girl who stood trembling between them, as if she alone understood what was happening. She risked turning her head toward them for heartbeat. Their faces, so often blank with fatigue, now flickered with something dangerously close to hope. It terrified her. Hope could get them all killed if misread by the wrong man. Another American jeep rolled to a stop beside the tank. Two soldiers jumped out, moving with the wary fluidity of men who had lived too long on battlefields. One aimed directly at the SS officer while the other approached the girl. His rifle wasn't raised, but it wasn't lowered either. It hovered at an angle that left every possibility open. She swallowed hard, aware of the mud on her boots, the trembling in her hands, the fact that she had never been this close to the enemy she had been taught to fear since childhood. "You speak English?" he asked. His voice was steady but not unkind. She nodded, though the truth was only barely so. He gestured for her to step aside, but something in her refused to move until she knew the SS officer could no longer fire. She shook her head vigorously and pointed at him. "He will harm them," she managed, her voice quavering. "Please." Perhaps it was the tone, or the sight of a German girl shielding foreign laborers, or the tension coursing through the group, but the meaning landed. The American shouted something to his comrades. Within seconds, 3 rifles were trained on the SS officer. The officer, seeing no path forward, lifted his hands very slowly. One soldier hurried forward, kicked the pistol out of reach, and shoved him toward the side of the road. The sound of the weapon clattering on stone was like a door slamming shut on one version of the future. For the first time, the girl let her arms fall. They ached from holding them aloft, but the relief was so sharp it made her knees wobble. She staggered a little, and the American closest to her reached out instinctively, steadying her elbow. The simple human gesture startled her more than the gunfire. In all the warnings she had been given about brutality, revenge, destruction, no one had ever mentioned that an American might touch her gently. The foreign workers remained rigid, afraid to move until ordered. The Polish man with the hollow cheeks glanced from her to the soldiers, as if trying to decipher whether this was rescue or simply a different form of captivity. One of the Americans noticed his hesitation and dug into his pack. He pulled out a chocolate bar, crinkled, half-melted, and tossed it lightly. It landed near the man's feet. The Pole stared at it as though it might explode. When he finally picked it up, his expression cracked into something fragile, disbelieving, and unbearably human. Behind him, the Ukrainian girl's eyes were shining with tears she had no strength to wipe away. The Americans began organizing the scene with practiced efficiency. A sergeant ordered the SS officer and his 2 subordinates to kneel at the roadside, hands over their heads. Another soldier motioned for the laborers to gather near the jeep, away from the prisoners. The girl hovered between the 2 groups, not sure where she belonged. The soldier who had steadied her studied her face for a long moment. "You with them?" he asked, nodding toward the SS. She shook her head fiercely. "No, never." He gestured then toward the laborers, as though asking whether she wished to stand with them. That answer came more hesitantly. She didn't know if she deserved to, but the Ukrainian girl, seeing her uncertainty, stepped forward. She touched the German's sleeve lightly, just enough to show she did not see her as an enemy. That single touch, more than the presence of tanks or rifles, nearly undid her. The Americans brought blankets, water, and hastily brewed coffee from a field kit. The foreign laborers drank greedily despite its harsh bitterness. To them it must have tasted like victory. The girl accepted a tin cup from a soldier and felt heat bloom through her cold fingers. She wondered whether her face betrayed how overwhelming it all felt. The smell of gasoline, the rattle of equipment, the sudden appearance of men who carried so much power yet offered food instead of blows. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the sergeant approached her with a clipboard. Through broken German and simple English, he managed to ask what had happened, why the column had been marching, why she had run into the road. She explained as best she could, the orders, the fear, the moment she couldn't bear to watch them taken away. Her voice faltered when she tried to describe the officer reaching for his pistol. The sergeant listened, nodding slowly, eyes narrowing only when she mentioned death marches she had heard whispered about. When she finished, he didn't praise or condemn her. Instead, he pointed toward the laborers. "They live because you spoke," he said. The words landed with a weight she had never felt before. Not flattery, but a kind of sober truth she wasn't sure she deserved. The Americans began preparing to transport the liberated workers to a larger gathering point. The girl watched as blankets were wrapped around thin shoulders, as bandages were applied to blistered feet, as murmured reassurances in unfamiliar accents filled the cooling air. The SS officer remained kneeling, defeated yet still glaring, His authority evaporated like mist in sunlight. And then came a moment she did not expect. As the Ukrainian girl climbed into the back of a truck, she turned, reached out her hand, and whispered a word of thanks. Not in German, not in English, but in her own language, soft and melodic. The meaning transcended language. The emotion struck like a bell. The truck engines revved. Soldiers signaled for departure. The girl took a step forward, wanting to say something, anything, but the words tangled. The convoy began to move, lifting dust that danced in the fading light. And as she stood in the middle of the road watching the people she had saved disappear into the dusk, a realization settled into her like an anchor. The Americans had not treated her as an enemy, but the question still hung over her future. When the dust cleared, when the tanks moved on, when Germany finally surrendered, how would her own country judge what she had done, and what would she become in the world that followed? In the weeks after Germany's surrender, the girl often wondered whether the world had ended or simply molted into something unrecognizable. The Bavarian hills looked the same. Green slopes, stone farmhouses, church bells drifting across the valley. But now American signposts sprouted along the roads like foreign flowers, and jeeps rattled past the same meadows where she had once gathered hay. Soldiers lounged near crossroads, their laughter mixing with the rustle of spring winds. The air smelled of blooming apple trees, diesel fumes, and a strange new uncertainty. It was in this unsettled atmosphere that her reckoning began. The first summons arrived on a scrap of official-looking paper nailed to the farmhouse door. She was to report to the local schoolhouse, now converted into a denazification center. The word felt heavy in her mouth, as though uttering it might summon ghosts. She walked there on a warm morning, passing neighbors who gave her brief, brittle nods, unsure whether they were sympathizing or silently judging. Every German now lived beneath the same unasked question: what did you know, and what did you choose? Inside the schoolhouse, desks had been shoved against the walls to make space for folding tables covered in documents. Chalk dust lingered in corners like the remnants of an interrupted childhood. American officers and German clerks sat together, sorting through the tangled lives of villagers who had sworn loyalty to a collapsing regime. When it was her turn, a young American lieutenant with tired eyes asked her to recount everything, from her labor service to the day she blocked the road. She spoke quietly, acutely aware that each word might tilt her fate. She explained her assignment to the farm, the conditions there, the fear that hung like frost in the air, and the moment she realized the foreign workers would never survive the march. The lieutenant listened without interruption, though his pen tapped lightly whenever she hesitated. When he asked why she had intervened, she searched for an answer that did not sound naive. Because it was wrong, she said finally. The simplicity embarrassed her, but the lieutenant nodded, as though simple truths were the only ones that mattered now. Still, he asked whether she had ever struck a laborer, or reported one, or benefited from their mistreatment. She swallowed hard and told him the truth. She had lived beside them, eaten more than they were allowed, followed rules she rarely questioned, and only at the end had she acted against them. Her honesty trembled in the air like a candle flame. The officers dismissed her for the day with no verdict. As she stepped outside, the late afternoon sun washed the schoolyard in gold. Children played on the swings, their shrieks of delight echoing against a backdrop of American uniforms. It seemed impossible that a country could crumble while its children still chased one another across the grass. In the following days, she found work helping in a nearby displaced persons camp, partly because she needed purpose, partly because the Americans suggested it would be good for German civilians to see things clearly. The camp had once been a textile warehouse. That day it did not. His words settled into her like a stone she would carry the rest of her life. Heavy, grounding, impossible to ignore. When her final hearing arrived, the American lieutenant handed her a thin file stamped with a verdict. She was classified as exonerated with reservations. Not a perpetrator, not a resistor, something in between. A young woman shaped by a system, but capable of breaking from it. She felt neither pride nor shame, only a strange humility. The lieutenant suggested she continue her work at the camp. People rebuild faster when someone sees them, he said. Maybe you understand that now. She nodded, realizing he was right. But even as she began to rebuild her days, guilt flickered at the edges like a persistent shadow. She thought of the thousands of marches where no one had stepped forward, where no American patrol had arrived in time. She wondered why she had waited so long to act. And yet, when she stood in the camp watching the workers share bread, sew new clothes, and tentatively discuss returning home. She sensed that mercy, however late, still had weight. One evening, as dusk seeped into the camp and lanterns flickered to life, she walked past the supply tent and saw a stack of American blankets like the one that had once been draped over her shoulders. Instinctively, she reached out and touched the coarse wool. In that moment, a quiet realization took shape. She had been spared, forgiven in ways she did not fully deserve. But forgiveness was not an erasure. It was an invitation, a chance to live differently. As she turned to leave, she noticed the Ukrainian girl approaching with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She pressed it into the German girl's hands. Inside lay a piece of blue string. Now, it was a humming city of the uprooted. Former laborers, prisoners, and refugees moved through its makeshift streets with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. She smelled wood smoke, boiled cabbage, detergent, and the faint medicinal sting of disinfectant. Here languages collided like birds in migration. Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, Yiddish, French, creating a symphony of survival. On her second afternoon there, she saw a familiar figure sitting near a cooking stove, the Ukrainian girl with the blue hair string. She was thinner than before, but alive, wrapped in an American blanket and stirring a pot with mechanical care. When their eyes met, the Ukrainian girl froze. The German girl felt panic spark in her chest. Would she be accused, rejected, blamed? But then the Ukrainian girl's mouth curved into a faint smile, fragile as thawing ice. She beckoned her closer with a small motion. Their conversation was clumsy, a mixture of gestures and halting words, yet somehow complete. The Ukrainian girl touched her own heart, then the German's sleeve, then pointed toward the road outside the camp. Gratitude, memory, a recognition that the moment between them had rewritten something neither could fully explain. The German felt her throat tighten. She had stepped into the road to save lives, but now she understood that the act had saved a piece of her own humanity as well, one that might otherwise have withered under the weight of silence. Word of her actions spread quietly through the camp. A Polish man she recognized from the farm approached her to say he had given testimony on her behalf during his processing. "You were not like the others," he said simply. She almost argued, insisting she had been blind for too long, but he shook his head before she could. "The world ended for us many times," he said. The same string she had once used to tie her hair. A simple token, light as a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. The German girl closed her fingers around it, feeling the delicate threads, and understood that some lives remained intertwined long after the march ended. And though she could not yet know how the future would unfold, she sensed that the road she had stepped into on that desperate day would follow her for the rest of her life, quietly reminding her that even in a shattered country learning to breathe again, the smallest acts of courage could echo far beyond the moment that birthed them. That's it for today's story. And before you go, please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.